My name is Alex, and my life is built on iron and leverage. I run a highly specialized mobile recovery and rigging service. When a multi-ton industrial generator needs to be delicately placed on a rooftop, or when a semi-trailer jackknifes off a cliff, my equipment is the solution. My primary asset is my rig, a custom-built, $500,000 machine, purpose-built for precision heavy lifting. It is not just a truck. It is a financial instrument, a tool of trade that requires meticulous maintenance, absolute security, and, crucially, space. I bought my home specifically because of its unique zoning. The plot, carved out decades ago before the community was developed, had a rare grandfathered clause allowing for commercial vehicles on the property. My driveway wasn't just asphalt. It was reinforced concrete, engineered to handle the load. This house was my fortress, my headquarters, and the place where I could finally be a homeowner without the constraints of petty rules. If that rig can't roll out, if I can't reach my clients, I don't just miss a meeting. I breach a contract, I lose thousands of dollars, and, worst of all, I destroy the professional reputation that took me 20 years to build. The consequence of downtime is catastrophic. For the first few months, I enjoyed a quiet, focused existence. I minded my business, kept my property immaculate, and made a point of waving to the few homeowners I saw. I believed I had escaped the bureaucratic tyranny that plagues so many modern subdivisions. I was wrong. The calm was merely the prelude to a storm delivered by Deborah, the unchallenged queen of the local HOA board. Deborah lived 3 houses down, in a structure that was less a home and more a shrine to sterile, predictable perfection. Her lawn was a chemically treated carpet of monoculture grass, and her SUV was always waxed to a mirror sheen. She was the archetype of the entitled people who define their entire self-worth by their ability to control others. She saw my working class, industrial vehicle not as a testament to honest labor, but as a glaring, unacceptable stain on her manicured kingdom. The hostility began subtly. The first notification wasn't a warning. It was a fine, a staggering $500 for unapproved exterior color of the mailbox post. My post was a perfectly sensible dark gray. Her underlying message was clear. I am watching you, and I do not approve. I immediately consulted my deed and the original HOA covenants, compiling a meticulous legal defense. I was professional, seeking to establish transparency and cooperation. I wrote a detailed, courteous letter to the HOA board secretary, referencing the specific clauses that protected my property rights and commercial vehicle status. Her response, however, was neither courteous nor legal. It came not from the secretary, but directly from Deborah's personal email, devoid of any formal letterhead, yet dripping with self-importance. She stated, "Mr. Alex, your outdated paperwork does not supersede the aesthetic standards of the current community. For the visual harmony of our street, your vehicle must be parked elsewhere. The fine stands, and the post must be repainted white by Friday." That single email revealed everything. She believed her opinion was the new law, and that the legal deed I possessed was simply a suggestion she was free to ignore. The fines escalated quickly. The second notice was $1,000 for unauthorized operational hours, citing a time when I had to leave for an emergency call at 4:30 a.m. The HOA had no actual rule governing noise or operational hours outside of standard city ordinances, but Deborah invented one, cementing my suspicion that this was a targeted campaign, not an effort to maintain the community. I tried calling the board members, only to find they were either unwilling to confront Deborah or were entirely complicit in her corruption. One board member, clearly terrified, whispered, "Just pay the fine, Alex. It's not worth the fight she brings." That was the moment I realized that pursuing standard justice through the HOA system was impossible. The system was rigged, and Deborah was both the judge and the executioner. I stopped sending polite letters. I started a physical dossier, a massive binder filled with security camera timestamps, logs of Deborah's drives past my house, photocopies of the fraudulent violation notices, and detailed printouts of the original property covenants. This wasn't about negotiation anymore. This was about gathering incontrovertible evidence for a much larger legal battle. I knew that to defeat this level of entitlement, I couldn't just sue the HOA, I had to expose the person running it. I had to prove a willful, malicious intent to destroy my livelihood. My anger wasn't a flash fire. It was a slow, controlled burn, fueling a resolve to not just win, but to obliterate the source of the conflict. But even with all my preparation, I was still operating within the bounds of reason and law. I had no idea how far Deborah was willing to go, or the level of malicious stupidity she would employ to get her way. She was about to escalate her petty war from sending nasty letters to committing an act of physical, deliberate sabotage that would cost me a fortune and push me past the point of no return. She was about to create the very justification I needed to unleash a response that the entire city, including the mayor, would never forget. She thought she was simply issuing a parking violation. She was, in fact, signing her own eviction notice from power. The morning of the crisis began at 5 a.m. sharp. This was not a routine day. This was the day I had been preparing for all week, a contract to deliver and place specialized, pressurized medical equipment for a hospital expansion downtown. The timeline was non-negotiable. The city permit window closed at 7:30 a.m., and missing that deadline meant a $25,000 penalty fee, plus the near-certain loss of all future high-profile government contracts, my reputation, my revenue, and the future viability of my business hinged entirely on that 7:30 a.m. arrival time. I was meticulous, professional, and ready to roll. I walked out of my house, coffee in hand, my helmet and gloves waiting in the cab of my rig. The morning air was cold, but my focus was laser-sharp. And then, I stopped dead. The sight that greeted me was not just a poorly parked vehicle. It was a deliberate, calculated act of financial sabotage. Deborah's immense, polished silver SUV was angled with such precise, malicious intent that it completely sealed off my industrial-grade driveway. The driver had used the width of her vehicle and the curb lines to perfection, ensuring that the sheer size of my rigging truck could not execute the turning radius necessary to exit onto the street. This was no accident. This was the final, devastating escalation of her entitlement. She hadn't left a note, she hadn't left a window cracked, and she hadn't given a single warning. The car was positioned like a barricade, a defiant symbol of HOA corruption, and there, mocking me from the windshield, was the official HOA Board Members decal. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew my business relied on that driveway, and she knew that by making my truck immobile, she was attacking my livelihood with the same cold brutality as taking a hammer to my engine block. The frantic calls started immediately. I first called the only number I had for Deborah, her personal mobile, but it went straight to a custom voicemail greeting that sounded far too cheerful for the situation. Then, I called the HOA office line, which, predictably, went to an automated message claiming they were unavailable until 9 a.m. Every minute ticking past was a minute closer to breaching that 7:30 a.m. deadline. My client, the hospital project manager, called me back, his voice strained with anxiety. I had to explain the unbelievable. I'm blocked in by my neighbor. I can't move my rig. I need a few hours to resolve this. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. He simply said, "Alex, if you miss the 7:30 window, the crane we rented goes home, the city permit expires, and the whole crew is on standby. We'll be in touch." That calm, professional disappointment was far more chilling than any shouting. That single line confirmed the devastating impact. The contract was gone, the penalty was coming, and worse than the money, my long-standing reputation for reliability, my most valuable asset, was shattered. In total, Deborah's 5 minutes of malicious parking had cost me over $30,000 in immediate fees and lost income, not counting the severe damage to my credibility in a highly specialized field. I walked around her car, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, fighting the primal urge to physically move the vehicle with my bare hands. I checked the doors locked. I checked the windows sealed. It was an armored fortress of pettiness. The thought of waiting hours for the police to maybe issue a ticket, or for a tow company to maybe accept the liability of an HOA dispute, was unbearable. The system had failed. The police had previously told me it was a civil matter. The towing companies were too timid to get involved. The HOA itself was the very source of the problem, run by the woman who was currently destroying my business. The channels of justice were deliberately clogged, all because of one entitled people determined to enforce her corrupt version of the community rules. The initial heat of my rage cooled, settling into a heavy, terrifying calm. I stood there, looking at my livelihood, my magnificent rig immobilized by a fragile silver SUV. I realized that responding to her with a fine, a lawsuit, or a complaint was simply meeting her on her own playing field. That field was rigged by her corruption. To truly win, to achieve a level of justice that would send an undeniable message of transparency to the entire city, I had to change the rules of the game. I had to use the one thing she feared and the one thing I controlled. Massive, unpredictable force. My mind, trained in complex logistics and problem solving, began working, not on moving the car to the street, but on maximizing the political and public impact of its movement. I looked up at the empty sky, then back at my rig, thinking about its crane arm, its lifting capacity, and the absurd possibility that was starting to form in my mind. The mayor had recently given a televised speech praising the exemplary organization of our local HOA boards. If Deborah's symbol of entitlement and corruption showed up on his front lawn, that praise would instantly turn into the biggest local news story of the year. It would drag her petty, venomous fight out of our obscure suburban street and into the blinding light of public scrutiny. I spent the next hour documenting the blockage. I took photos of the license plate, the HOA decal, the tight angle, and a video showing the futility of even attempting to drive out. I carefully recorded the phone calls to the police and the HOA, creating an airtight legal defense showing that I had exhausted every reasonable, legal, and standard method of resolution before resorting to the extreme. The Reddit story I was about to create would not be one of an angry homeowner losing his cool, but one of a calm professional executing a surgical act of perfect revenge against a system designed to protect entitled people. I walked back inside, the lost contract already forgotten. My focus had shifted entirely. I was no longer concerned with lifting medical equipment. My new priority was the logistics of a very, very heavy publicity stunt, one that would redefine the meaning of HOA enforcement. The initial shock of the $30,000 loss quickly hardened into an icy determination. I spent the next 6 hours making one final, exhausting circuit of failure, meticulously documenting every dead end. I called the non-emergency police 3 times, each time emphasizing the financial damage and the malicious intent of the HOA board member. The answer was always the same, a robotic recitation of policy. Sir, we cannot forcibly move a vehicle unless it poses an immediate safety hazard, which a parked car, however inconvenient, does not. They were paralyzed by liability and political fear, choosing to protect the aggressor simply because she was the one who appeared to have authority. My final attempt was calling 5 different local towing companies. Every single one refused the job. The moment I mentioned unauthorized parking by an HOA board member, the phone line went cold. They all knew Deborah's reputation. They knew the lawsuit she would launch against anyone who touched her immaculate vehicle. Her entitlement had created a legal force field around her car. The system was designed to resolve conflict, but in this specific instance, it was designed to protect the powerful and crush the average homeowner. The message was terrifyingly clear. You are trapped, Alex, and Deborah wins. It was this complete, absolute failure of the system, the police, the HOA, and the private sector that provided the cold, hard justice I needed. It removed any ethical ambiguity about my next steps. If every conventional, legal, and civil method of removing a vehicle maliciously blocking a business operation has failed, then the law recognizes the right of the injured party to abate the nuisance through any necessary means. I wasn't going to break the law. I was going to push the boundaries of civil remedy to their absolute breaking point, relying on the fact that I had an airtight record of her malicious corruption and my own desperate attempts at resolution. My focus shifted from recovery to retaliation. My unique skill set triggering, logistics, and heavy transport made the absurd idea of an airlift the only viable, damage-free solution. I researched the technical specifications. The Karen's SUV weighed roughly 5,000 pounds. A light utility helicopter could easily handle that load. I began making discreet calls to air cargo and specialized lift companies hundreds of miles away. Pretending to be a film production manager needing staged aerial maneuvers for a secret military commercial, I needed a certified pilot and rigging team willing to work under deep secrecy. Late at night, for a sum of money that would make them forget to ask too many questions. The legal framework was even more crucial than the logistics. I spent hours poring over city and county ordinances. I discovered that, while forcibly removing an illegally parked vehicle from private property is generally legal, towing it to a junkyard or placing it on a public street is complicated. But placing it on the property of a high-profile public official, that was territory yet to be charted. I chose the mayor for 3 calculated reasons. Firstly, his recent, televised, glowing endorsement of the HOA boards in the local media provided the perfect political context. He had publicly championed the very system that Deborah was using for her personal vendetta. Secondly, his house was centrally located and famously featured for its impeccable lawn canvas that would ensure maximum visual shock and media coverage. This wasn't just revenge. It was an act of public transparency for the entire community. Thirdly, the resulting chaos would force the city to address the issue of HOA corruption directly, something they had always ignored as a private matter. The cost estimates came back. The price for the high-risk, discreet nighttime airlift was nearly double the financial loss Deborah had inflicted upon me. But this wasn't an expense. It was an investment in reclaiming my professional dignity and permanently removing the tyranny of this entitled people. I realized that if I simply sued her, the outcome would be a quiet court settlement. Nobody would ever know the depth of her maliciousness. If I executed the airlift, the image, the sheer audacity of it would be immortalized as a viral Reddit story. A legend of justice served from the sky. I secured the financing, signing contracts under an LLC I created specifically for the operation. I instructed the pilot to use a specific, high-tensile, non-marking rigging system to ensure the vehicle was lifted without a single scratch. I wanted the police and the insurance investigators to find no evidence of vandalism, only the perfectly legal removal of an abandoned obstruction. The plan was a masterpiece of cold, professional execution, fueled by the deep-seated anger of a homeowner who had finally been pushed too far. The rigging professional inside me was now working for the furious homeowner, and the target wasn't just a silver SUV. It was Deborah's entire worldview of entitlement and impunity. Everything was ready. The logistics were sound, the legal defense was airtight, and the stage was set for the most unforgettable act of urban guerrilla warfare the city had ever seen. The transition from planning to execution was instantaneous and exhilarating. I rendezvoused with the flight crew, 2 men and a pilot, all professionals who asked exactly 0 probing questions, preferring to focus on the 6-figure wire transfer that had just cleared. I gave them only the most necessary details: the weight, the pickup coordinates, and the extremely specific drop-off point. My cover story remained secret: aerial staging for a major international advertising campaign. The money bought discretion, and that discretion was the most valuable asset in the entire operation. We moved back into the community in the darkest part of the hour. Just past 2 a.m., I had instructed the pilot to use the quietest possible approach vector, hugging the distant highway noise until the final descent into the neighborhood. From my position, watching my security camera feed on a laptop inside my truck, the sight of the heavy lift helicopter, a machine built for disaster relief and construction, looming silently over my quiet suburban street, was surreal. It was the perfect contrast, the ultimate industrial force brought to bear on the pettiest form of domestic corruption. The ground crew, masked and operating with military precision, had the SUV secured within 5 minutes. I watched as they attached the reinforced yellow lift slings, the same kind I used to hoist sections of prefabricated bridges to the designated chassis points. There was no damage, no scraping, no frantic fumbling. This was professionalism at its peak. The only sound was the low, purposeful whine of the helicopter rotors in the distance, a sound that quickly escalated into a roaring vortex as the machine maneuvered directly over Deborah's illegally parked property. The lift was the moment of truth. The massive downwash from the rotors slammed into the street, forcing the lights of the quiet street to flicker. I saw the silver SUV, the immaculate symbol of her entitlement, slowly, smoothly rise off the ground. It hung suspended in the night air, its own weight now completely irrelevant, dwarfed by the power of the machine above it. It was a beautiful, ridiculous sight, the tangible result of HOA corruption being literally airborne. My heart hammered, not from fear, but from the realization of the absolute, cold justice I was enacting. This wasn't an angry, spontaneous outburst. This was a calculated, expensive solution to a problem that the civil authorities refused to handle. I had exhausted every legal avenue, and now I was simply applying the only tool left in my arsenal. The pilot received the all-clear, and the helicopter, carrying its ridiculously mundane payload, ascended swiftly and then pivoted, flying a tight, low-altitude route directly toward the center of town. I followed in my surveillance truck, maintaining radio silence. The journey was short, lasting less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes was all it took to move the symbol of Deborah's petty tyranny from my doorstep to the front lines of the city's political landscape. The target, the mayor's home, was a monument to public success, a grand, colonial structure with a flawless, emerald green lawn that was featured in the local community magazine every spring. I watched through my binoculars as the helicopter descended with a level of control that was breathtaking. The pilot didn't drop the car. He placed it. The SUV settled with a soft, definitive third exactly in the center of the lawn, perfectly level, pointed directly at the mayor's front door. The HOA Board Members' vehicle was now sitting where a fountain or a statue of civic pride should have been. It was pristine, untouched, and utterly ridiculous. The helicopter immediately jettisoned the slings and flew off toward the industrial park, the noise fading back into the low hum of the city. I stayed for only a minute, long enough to capture several perfect high-resolution photographs of the surreal scene. The silver SUV, the clear HOA decal, the sprawling mansion, all bathed in the cold, distant light of the street lamps. It was the ultimate, undeniable photographic evidence. I had removed an illegal obstruction from my property, delivered it to the one place in the city that would guarantee public transparency, and done so without causing a single scratch to the vehicle itself. Driving away, a profound sense of calm settled over me. I hadn't just moved a car, I had detonated a political bomb. The silent fury that had been building since the first fraudulent fine was finally satisfied. Deborah, in her entitlement, had believed that my ability to fight was limited to the confines of a civil court docket. She never imagined that my technical expertise and professional resources would be turned against her, not with anger, but with cold, expensive precision. The local Reddit story was about to write itself, and the chaos would be monumental. I knew the police would soon be knocking, but I also knew they wouldn't be knocking for a confession. They would be knocking for an explanation, and I had a meticulously documented, airtight defense ready to go. The war was no longer fought on my driveway. The war was now fought in the media, and I had just claimed the high ground. The sun did not so much rise that morning as it shone a massive spotlight directly onto the chaos I had created. The scene at the mayor's residence was biblical in its absurdity. Within hours, the front lawn had become ground zero for every news outlet in the region. Helicopters that were not mine were circling overhead. Camera crews were fighting for the best angle of the surreal public art installation, and Mayor Thompson himself was having a magnificent, televised meltdown. The spectacle was perfect. The silver SUV, the emblem of petty HOA entitlement, sat there, untouched and pristine, a monument to bureaucratic failure. The media instantly seized on the story, but the narrative quickly changed. It wasn't just a bizarre prank, it became a political embarrassment. The mayor, who had just spent 2 weeks praising the effectiveness and transparency of local HOA boards, now had the physical, 5,000-pound evidence of HOA corruption sitting directly in his rose garden. Every reporter was demanding to know why the vehicle hadn't been towed, why the police hadn't acted, and who was responsible for the vehicle that was clearly marked with an official HOA Board Members decal. I watched the initial reports from the quiet safety of my truck, documenting the extent of the chaos, knowing that every minute of news coverage was worth $10,000 in legal fees. Inevitably, the authorities came for me. The police, followed by a confused city attorney, arrived at my door around noon. They were aggressive, demanding to know who was behind the stunt. I welcomed them in, offered them water, and remained perfectly calm. They tried to hit me with everything: vandalism, illegal dumping, even grand larceny. But my legal strategy was already in place. I pointed out the obvious. The car was undamaged. It was moved, not stolen. And the movement, while unusual, was a direct and necessary response to a malicious, documented obstruction of my commerce. My lawyer, who had been on standby and was now fully briefed, arrived and immediately took over. He presented the authorities with the dossier of failure. This was not just a folder. It was a 3-inch binder detailing every fine, every email, the specific language of my deed, and most critically, the time-stamped recordings of my calls to the police, the towing companies, and the HOA itself. The evidence showed that I had requested legal intervention, police assistance, and professional towing services, all of which were denied due to the specific, paralyzing fear of litigation stemming from the HOA Karen's malicious behavior. The argument was simple and devastatingly effective: malicious obstruction of commerce. We argued that Deborah's deliberate act of blocking my driveway, costing me $30,000, was the primary crime. My removal of the vehicle, done in a manner that preserved the vehicle and caused no damage, was simply the abatement of an active and documented nuisance. We demonstrated that I had acted as a responsible homeowner pushed into an extreme corner by a corrupt system. I had not violated the law. I had executed an expensive form of self-help after the legal guardians of justice failed to respond. The police realized they were in a quagmire. They couldn't charge me with theft because I didn't steal the car. I removed an obstacle from my property. They couldn't charge me with vandalism because the car was perfect. They couldn't charge me with illegal dumping because the destination was public property, and the owner of the car had clearly abandoned it by neglecting to leave a note or a number when she knew she was destroying my business. The political pressure on the mayor and the police to find a culprit was immense, but the legal reality was a brick wall. Meanwhile, Deborah was experiencing the true meaning of public transparency. Her face, her name, and the clear image of her HOA Board Members decal were splashed across every screen in the city. Her petty, private war was now a viral Reddit story entitled "People Abusing Their Power." She was forced to make a public statement, which was rambling, frantic, and only solidified her guilt. She claimed the car was stolen, a claim immediately debunked by the undamaged condition of the vehicle and the eyewitness accounts of the low-flying helicopter. She had nowhere left to hide. Her fortress of corruption and arrogance had been demolished by the sheer absurdity of her own consequences. My lawyer informed the city that we were preparing a massive civil suit against Deborah and the entire HOA for the malicious destruction of my business income. This flipped the script entirely. The police were no longer investigating me. They were being pressured to investigate the HOA's governance and Deborah's clear abuse of power. The airlift was the most expensive and effective deposition ever conducted. It cost me a fortune, but in return, I bought myself total immunity and the undeniable high ground in the battle for justice. I had successfully turned a simple HOA dispute into a city-wide conversation about accountability, and the HOA Karen is about to face the consequences of her profound overreach. The legal reckoning that followed the airlift was swift and absolute. Faced with the mountain of evidence, we had compiled the legal fines, the documentation of my calls for help, and the undeniable visual proof of her malicious obstruction. Deborah had zero room to maneuver. The final death blow came from the insurance and liability firms representing the HOA, the moment they saw the video evidence proving her intent to obstruct commerce. They realized the liability was hers alone, and catastrophic. They refused to cover her defense, fearing that a protracted legal battle would expose deeper corruption within the board. The lawsuit, which was poised to be filed as an 8-figure claim against Deborah for the systematic destruction of my business income, never made it to court. She settled. She paid every cent we demanded, the initial $30,000 in lost income, the astronomical cost of the helicopter operation, all my legal fees, and a significant punitive fine for emotional distress and abuse of authority. Her personal assets, accumulated over years of entitlement, were liquidated to cover the settlement. It was a complete financial annihilation, a consequence delivered not by a vengeful homeowner, but by the immutable logic of the courts when faced with irrefutable evidence. The cost of justice was high even with the settlement. The emotional toll and the initial outlay were staggering, but the victory was priceless. My lawyer emphasized that the airlift was the single most effective legal maneuver he had ever witnessed, turning a complex, internal HOA dispute into a public political crisis that forced the hands of the authorities. It created the public pressure needed to ensure that Deborah could not simply hide behind the procedural shield of the HOA board. The viral fame of the Reddit story had generated became the lever that pried open the doors of transparency. The ultimate consequence for Deborah was the irreversible loss of status. Her resignation from the HOA board was immediately followed by her virtual expulsion from the community. The respect she had demanded through fear and entitlement vanished, replaced by a cold, universal scorn. She was no longer the queen. She was a criminal who had tried to destroy a neighbor's business. Her entire identity, built on the brittle foundation of her position, crumbled. The physical sight of her SUV being ignominiously removed from the mayor's lawn by a generic, flatbed tow truck, a mundane, anticlimactic end to the great airborne spectacle, was the perfect visual metaphor for the end of her reign. The true, lasting victory, however, wasn't financial. It was communal. With Deborah gone, the remaining board members immediately resigned, fearful of litigation and public scrutiny. An emergency election was held, and a new HOA board was instated comprised of sensible homeowners who valued communication and common sense over micromanagement and corruption. They immediately rescinded all fraudulent fines, reformed the bylaws to include genuine transparency measures, and, crucially, reaffirmed my original commercial vehicle clause. Our community transformed almost overnight. The atmosphere of hushed fear and passive aggression evaporated, replaced by genuine neighborly engagement. People began talking again, bonding over the shared trauma and the spectacular way the tyrant was defeated. I look back now at the rig sitting in the driveway. It's clear, unblocked, and ready for work. I'm no longer just a homeowner. I'm a guardian. I learned that bureaucracy, when weaponized by entitled people, can be more destructive than any physical force. But I also learned that if the system fails, if justice is denied, a calm, professional, and well-resourced individual can sometimes create the necessary disruption to fix it. The airlift was an extreme measure, an expensive joke played on a system of corruption, but it was the only measure that could have guaranteed my dignity, my business, and the peace of the entire neighborhood. I reclaimed my property, I reclaimed my reputation, and in doing so, I helped reclaim the soul of my community. The driveway is clear, and the threat is gone. My life, built on precision and power, has finally found a powerful, enduring peace.